Welcome. My name is Nicola Harris. I'm the Speech Pathology Australia's Manager for Professional Practice, and I have with me Anna Pannuzzo from WorkPlacePLUS, and we're going to continue our discussions around the workplace. So Anna, we've talked quite a lot in other segments around contracts and around the pay and the award that covers speech pathologists, and about the difference between an employee and contractor. So now we're going to move on and talk about once someone has a job, what can they expect that will happen when they first start a job, and the legal obligations that an employer will talk to them about in those first few days?
Yes. Thanks, Nicola, for let's start off talking about how it's fantastic. You've now got your job, and you've got that contract and you've signed it, and that is one of the things that you need to make sure you're clear and understand what your responsibilities are. Mm-hmm. There would be a position description, and the first couple of days I would hold that with me and make sure that I understand that. Generally, in the first couple of days with an employer, there would be things like filling out necessary forms, your superannuation form, your tax file, any other information that they may want you to fill out, like your bank details so they can commence your pay, any working with children checks or police checks that they might want you to do. Mm-hmm. That would be all the necessary paperwork that will need you to complete on the first couple of days. They also may do what we call an onboarding or an induction program, where they familiarise yourself with the organisation, the policies and procedures, the values and mission statement, key stakeholders, access to the technology in the office, who are the key people within the organisation that you might need to speak to, and understand a little bit about the culture of the organisation. So the first couple of days is really getting familiar with those things, but also understanding how do you fit into the organisation, what's the structure like, and what might be your responsibilities. So in that first couple of days, the manager or the employer may sit down and talk about what are the key result areas that they'll be looking at you doing and undertaking, and how they will communicate, provide feedback and measure your performance. So those are really key, especially if you're in every new employee has a probation trial period. You may want to understand when are the key meeting times that you might be looking at to have some feedback and an opportunity to discuss any concerns. So that would be generally one of the things that a new employee would be looking at. So the other important thing is when you start, and I only know from my own experiences, when you start with a new employer, make sure that your pay rate is as per your contract. Make sure you got paid either in the fortnight or the month that you were advised. If there's any queries, then do it then. If you've got any queries about your entitlement, ask. There's nothing stopping you, and it's really good to ask and how things work.
Fantastic, yeah. And I think this is probably a good time to remind members that on the Speech Pathology Australia website we have quite a few information sheets around some of the things that you've talked about, and particularly around things like working with children checks, and I know that we're doing some other modules, learning modules around indemnity insurance and Medicare provider numbers and things that people might want to find out about as well that might be important in their workplace too. And that they can contact WorkPlacePLUS if they've got any questions around not getting paid and those kinds of issues as well that are happening in their job. Fantastic, that's good. As well as all the things you've discussed, most businesses will have a policy and procedures. What are the first kind of policies and procedures that someone starting in a role might hear about in the first few days?
We always recommend that a practice or an employer have things like a code of conduct. Mm-hmm. So that really just sets down the ways that employees behave and what we call the rules of engagement within an employer. So I call that the code of conduct. Then there would be things like a discipline procedure. Mm-hmm. Would be performance management and how your performance is reviewed. Any grievances, how do you put in a grievance or complaint? An occupational health and safety policy, which includes any accidents or issues that occur within the organisation. How do you report an incident? Yep. And then the last one is any complaints about bullying and harassment, or relationship behavioural issues that you may need to report to the employer. How do you do that? So they're the sort of key that I would argue any employer should have. And if they don't have access to that, your website does, and they can utilise that. But again, there's a number of different good websites that you can access various policies and procedures, but you can also ring us. Yes.
Yeah. And also, if you've got questions about any of those issues, to have a chat with your employer as well, or you're at the HR department of the larger organisations as well. Yeah.
That's a good point there. With the larger organisations, they generally should have them, and you should make yourself aware of those in the first couple of weeks as part of your induction and orientation. They generally would make you familiar and aware of those, and it's a good time when you're starting off to read those.
Right, absolutely. Well, thank you for outlining those. The other thing that I wanted to touch on today is that a lot of speech pathologists in their role may find themselves having to be outside of their regular workplace. So they might be a mobile practitioner who's going into someone's home to deliver services. They might be going into a residential and aged care facility. Can you have touch on some of the things that speech pathologists need to be aware of when they're going out and conducting that type of work?
That's a good topic and a good thing to talk about, because that then extends the workplace. So if they're being asked to visit a client in a residential facility, that then becomes their workplace. So the employer is responsible for that employee who then goes to a client, and anything that occurs in that workplace whilst that employee is attending, the employer is responsible. If they're a mobile practice and they're utilising their vehicle, that vehicle becomes their workplace.
Yep.
They're visiting the client. So there are lots of things there that they're liable and responsible, both of them, which is the safety component.
Absolutely, yeah.
Who's responsible for the vehicle? What are some of the things that the employee needs to be aware of, and the risks, and the employer also. So part of that, starting in the new position, if they're going to be a mobile practice, the employer needs to look at those things and clearly identify the responsibilities of the therapist and also the employer, and what happens when an incident occurs. How do you report it? How do you deal with it? Where do they go?
Yeah, and I think, as you've said, safety is certainly a real priority particularly for people going into people's homes to do services and things too, and making sure that there's processes around making so that they can manage if something happens to go wrong.
Correct. So a good practice might have what I call the OH&S policy, which has some checklists that they go through with the employee about the mobile practice, the vehicle that that they have a driver's licence, that their car is roadworthy, it's safe, that insured, etc. So there's no surprises, and that's part of a good checklist that a practice should have and provide to the employee, and say these are the things that are required as someone who's running a mobile practice, and these will be our responsibilities. This is how insurance will cover it, and this is when there's an issue, how we deal with it, and who is responsible to following that through. Yeah.
And perhaps some some policies and procedures around what happens once you're in the home as well, around managing that too if something happens.
Correct. A lot of the larger organisations have these things in more than a private practice, but if you are asking staff to do this sort of work, you also have the same obligation and you have the same responsibility. So it is important that if you do commence this mobile practice, that you have those checklists, safety. The things, there are websites that are available. WorkSafe does have checklists available on its website that talks about working at home or working a mobile practice, and that might be some information there. Or you can drop me an email, and I'm more than happy to send as much resources as I can provide.
Fantastic, thank you. And I think it's just a good opportunity to make sure that anyone who's starting in a workplace knows that these policies and procedures are there to protect them, and that they should have discussions with people around them as well.
Yes.
So thank you. Thanks, Anna, for outlining all of that today. It was
Thanks,
very
Nicola.
handy.
Thanks, my pleasure.